Oban 14 is going to be the Scotch we're looking at today. Hello, I'm Brendan O'Neill, and welcome to Whistery, where we take whiskey and we blend in some history, and if anything else comes along, we'll throw that in too. Could be travel, could be another spirit, but most of this is going to be focused on the good stuff. So let's dive right in. This Scotch comes from a town named Oban in Scotland. It's a West Highland Scotch, and I did check. It is not Oban, it is not Oban, it is Oban, and I learned that on my most recent trip to Scotland. I want to dive in with this because, quite frankly, this is my favorite Highland Scotch. I've got some other favorites, but this one ranks supreme for my Highland choices. So let's go ahead and dive right in, get some tasting notes done. And you'll notice I'm using what's called a Glencairn glass. It's wider at the base, tapers towards the top in almost like a tulip pattern. And the reason for that is by having the wider base, it allows more surface area for the whiskey's flavors and smells to come through and get to your nose. That way the alcohol doesn't overwhelm your sense of smell, which, as we know, is a big part of your sense of taste. And then when you begin tasting, like I always do, you want to really get your nose in there and then take a break. Really get your nose in there again, and then move it around. Kind of prep your senses for what you're about to taste, and then take a sip. Now you notice that I really took my time with it. Rolled it around my tongue, really let it touch all of my taste buds, so I get a full sense of what it's offering. And I can tell you right now, I immediately get a hint of spice. I'm definitely getting some toasted oak, which I love. Hint of peat, a little bit of salt, and just along those lines, Oban 14 comes from, as I said, the town of Oban, which is right on the water. It sits on a harbor in the West Highlands, and it's pinned between the water and the town. And some interesting notes about the distillery is that it can't grow any bigger because it's jammed up against the water in the town. It's as big as it's going to get. As a matter of fact, this distillery only has 2 stills. They make some other scotches along, for example, Oban Little Bay, and they make one that's been aged longer than the Oban 14. But I chose this today because, again, it's my favorite West Highland Scotch. It picks up hints of the water, even though, because of their space limitations, it has to be aged inland at some point because they just don't have the capacity. But it picks up enough of the maritime characters to impart some of that. In that respect, it's a little bit like an Islay, although not all the way there. If you've had an Islay, you know that it's punchy in the face with the peat and the brine and the iodine, which I also love. But it develops slowly in your mouth, and then it hangs on. It's got a great finish. You know, we want to get the aroma, we want to get the taste of it, but then we also want to focus on the finish. I'm getting some fruity notes, I feel like dried apricot, perhaps. There's something else in there. I'm trying to identify it. Well, maybe if I add a little water, that'll help open it up. So I have spring water here, and one of the things you want to do with Scotch, if you're really appreciating it, is after you've taken it just out of the bottle, take a few drops of spring water, and make sure it's spring water. It's cheap. You can get it at your local grocery store. The water that comes out of your tap is going to have chlorine and other chemicals in it. Spring water will have minerals, but those will actually add to the flavor experience. And the reason why we add a little bit of water, just a few drops, mind you, is because it really opens up the Scotch and opens up additional flavors that you're not going to get when the Scotch is just by itself. So I'll hold this up. I'm just going to put in, maybe a drop, two drops. Move that around the glass. Yeah. On my nose, it definitely opens up more of the maritime features of it. I feel like I'm getting more salt. Almost like a hint of seaweed. Oh, wow. Then on the sip, you get a lot more fruit. And now I'm getting orange peel. And mind you, everyone's palate is going to be different. I will pick up things that you won't, and vice versa. I sampled a Scotch with a friend of mine, and I got lemon zest and some wheatgrass, and he ended up getting what he thought was a hint of pear. So that's the beauty of it. Everyone's going to have a little bit different experience, but you're going to have the basic profile down. And I would pair this with, you could do seafood. I could do like a crab boil, blackened sea bass, maybe some Cajun shrimp. It's got enough spice to stand up to those, but would complement them and not overwhelm the delicacy of a seafood. And honestly, I've had this with steak, and it was fantastic. I would also say it's slightly oily. It's nice. It sits on your tongue, but it's not too heavy. It's got a certain dryness to it that offsets the oiliness, and it creates a perfect balance. I really like this. So we've talked about the Scotch, a little bit about the distillery. By the way, it's funny, because of their space constraints, they actually get their water from a loch, which is Gaelic for lake, some distance away, but it's fresh inland water that's purified and has an enormous amount of minerals to it that add flavors to it. And again, I'm getting more of the spice coming out now. I think the water broke that open a little bit too, but the spice is on the back end. All right, so we've talked about Oban 14. Now let's talk a little bit of history. I don't think you can really talk about Scotch unless you know where it comes from. And basically, whiskey, as we all know, is a distilled barley. They create a mash, and they then distill it down and draw out the alcohol. But where did that whole process come from? And it started actually in Mesopotamia and Babylonia, excuse me. Probably in the second millennia, BC. But they didn't distill it for alcohol to drink. They were actually making perfumes. So that knowledge was then passed on to the Egyptians, who also used it for perfume, and then the Greeks, and eventually the Romans, and they were doing it as well. And we have a lot to thank the Romans for, because, you know, they pushed into France, what's now France, and what they called Gaul then, and the Celts were there. And they eventually pushed them into what is now the British Isles and Ireland. And when the Romans had crossed over, they realized that wine wasn't going to work there. It could in southern France, but the further north they went, like into Germany, and when they got to England, it was just too cold. They could grow grapes, but the acidity was so high that it was giving them stones, like kidney stones and other things. So that pushed not only the development of beer, but ultimately the development of whiskey. And just to be clear, the name whiskey is Gaelic for Uiscí Bea, which means water of life. In Latin, it's aqua vitae, but it's pronounced Uiscí Bea. And again, it's a tough word. Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are some very difficult languages to master. But once you get it down, you'll never forget it. So the Romans realized that this isn't going to work, and they were also brewing some kind of a basic beer. And then when they became Christianized, of course, there was the expanse of monasteries, and they moved into Ireland, where the monasteries were really starting to experiment with distillation. And that's really when you first got the art form of creating what we now know as whiskey. So they believe they started in Ireland, and then it got moved into Scotland. And what's funny about the Scots is they took the ball and ran with it. They went distilling on steroids, I guess you'd say. So what ended up happening was, eventually, you know, the monks, it was like a barley beer that they were making, and then they got the idea, well, why don't we distill that further down? And then they came up with whiskey. And then along comes King Henry VIII, and he, as we all know, during the Reformation, he took over the monasteries, pretty much pushed all these guys out. And then you have a whole bunch of monks with no job, but they needed to make a living. And what they did was they started ramping up distilleries. That was how they made their living. They could make it, sell it. I mean, hey, they had bills to pay. So that happens. And it really took off like a shot again in Scotland. They seem to have ramped up faster than the Irish and really started moving on this. And from there, it just took off. I mean, I would view what the Scotch did almost like what's going on today in the craft distillery world. These guys that we have here and where I'm at in Denver and around this country and even in other parts of the world, they're getting very creative. They're making these amazing spirits. You know, whiskeys, gins, vodkas, things like that. And I really feel like, in a way, it was what happened in Scotland, and to a lesser extent, Ireland, but really in Scotland. Which is why I think you see so many more distilleries in Scotland versus Ireland until this day. So that's the history. There's a lot more to it than that. I wanted to give you an overview, but at your next cocktail party, you can at least say, I know where whiskey comes from. Or maybe it helps you win at trivia night at your local pub. Who knows? But I hope you enjoy this review of Oban 14. I recommend it. Scotch is not cheap. So what we're hoping to do here is give people a chance to hear what we think and give you our thoughts and have you hopefully make a more educated decision before you go out and drop, 90 or 100 or in some cases $180 on a bottle of whiskey. It'll help you kind of narrow it down. Or maybe you'll take a chance on an $18 pour at a bar because you really want to try it. So if you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up. If you really liked it, please subscribe. We're going to have videos coming out each week. If you would like to join the Whiskey Clan, You can go to our website, and that's whisky.org. Get on our mailing list. On the website, we have the reviews we just discussed, and tidbits, travel tips, food pairings, things like that. Oh, and one other thing I would add with this Scotch actually goes very well with cheeses as well. So if you set up a charcuterie plate, I meant to mention that earlier. And I've done that before. This wonderful, beautiful Scotch from the West Highlands goes great with meats and cheeses. So consider that an experiment. You might find that it goes great with peanut butter or dark chocolate. Who knows? And the link to the website is going to be down below. Again, that's whisky.org. And don't forget the famous words of William Faulkner. And that is that civilization begins with distillation. And not only was he a prolific author, but a very wise man. So thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll see you next time on Whisky. Sláinte, or as the Scots say, Slán Javar.